Back to tacNtrack. Today we're continuing our World War II series with the Mosin Negant M91 30 3-line rifle.
This is a big rifle. Go for a smaller one. On our last round. I like this rifle.
If you guys have been following us for a while, you know that we're covering a bunch of World War II rifles, pistols, and shotguns ahead of a competition where we're going to shoot these guns up against one another head to head. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Please hit that sub button down there for me because we're going to be bringing a lot more of this kind of content to you guys. So we're going to cover the Mosin M91 30 today, and we're going to start off by talking about some of the rifles that led to the design of the Mosin M91 30. We're going to talk about the designers, then we will talk about the design, and we'll go into a little bit of depth on this rifle in particular because this is the one that we will be shooting. So we will talk about this particular example of the M91 30, and because we're covering the Mosin Negant, we have to talk about some of the myths that exist and surround this particular rifle. So stay tuned as we bounce through all this, and don't forget, down there at the bottom, we've got everything broken out for you guys, so if y'all want to skip around, right down there at the bottom, everything's broken out for you. Alright, so before we can talk about the Mosin Negant M91 30, we have to talk about the Berdan rifle and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. The Berdan rifle was a single-shot bolt-action rifle, so there was no magazine feed system to it. It was a 10.7 by 58 millimeter cartridge, but it was black powder. So this is pre-smokeless powder. The Berdan rifle was actually designed in America, so it's not a homegrown Russian design, and we'll see this rifle really pretty much is. Now there's influences from outside of Russia that go into it. This is pretty much a Russian rifle. Now during the Turkish War, they encountered some of the trapdoors and some of the Winchester repeating rifles. And what the Turks were able to do is use a rifle that had a significantly better range to hit the Russian troops from a distance in which they couldn't fire back on. And then they were able to pick up their Winchester repeaters as the Russians approached, and were able to use the firepower of the internal magazine of the Winchester lever action in order to fend off the Russian troops. And this proved to be absolutely brutal. Didn't stop the Russians from winning, because Russia, of course, has the manpower to just throw into that meat grinder. But really, all of the European powers look at this particular conflict and say, well, we certainly need rifles that have a long range, are good at range, have an internal magazine so we can increase the firepower of our troops so we don't end up getting slaughtered like the Russians did. And once again, Russians proved victorious here, but they proved victorious by sheer manpower. So that starts us on the path to the development of the M91 30. It also sets us on the path for the French Lebel. We see a bunch of rifles kind of spawn out of this particular conflict as everybody kind of looks at it. Now the Russians are some of the slowest to adopt here, and I actually think it works out in their benefit, because they're basically able to skip 2 generations of rifles to come to this guy, and they don't have to keep rearming their forces like the Americans do with Craig. And you know, we see a bunch of the military powers through this time period go from a black powder bolt action to a smokeless powder bolt action to then a magazine fed smokeless powder bolt action, and the Russians kind of skip all of that and go straight to this rifle. So at its introduction, it's fairly modern. Now they do hold on to it for a long time, and we can't really talk about the World War II context of this gun without looking at its competitors, which we'll talk about when we compare it to all of these, this rifle is somewhat dated. And the Russians were actually planning to replace it with the SVT-40 ahead of World War II. They just weren't able to field them and produce them in the numbers in which they needed. And this guy proved to be the reliable rifle that Russia needed and could get. So with that being said, let's take a look at the design process that went into this particular rifle. When we're talking about Russian firearms of World War II, we have a tendency to look at the Soviets. But for this rifle, we need to take a step back in time before the Soviets took power. This rifle was designed by the Russian imperial bureaucracy, which makes its design history a little bit harder to trace than some of the other guns that we've covered. It was basically broken down into two separate design teams and bureaus looking at two separate things. The first thing they were looking at was they wanted a smokeless powder, modern cartridge firing bolt action rifle, and they took that as a totally separate project from the magazine and magazine feed system that was being developed to go with the rifle. So they had one team basically working on the rifle design and a separate team working on magazine and magazine feed design, and then they were going to combine these two into a rifle, and that's what we get here. The rifle gets its name from two of the designers that worked on this project. There were many, many more working on this project. It was really a group effort in which homegrown Russian designs were encouraged. So Sergei Ivanovich Mosin was the lead designer who designed most of the action and bolt for this rifle. Now there's a bunch of other people that play into this, and the Russians draw inspiration from a bunch of foreign designs, particularly French at this point in time that they're looking at, but it really is a homegrown Russian affair for this. Now, the magazine feed system borrows heavily from Nagant, and Nagant is a Belgian who's working on a bunch of other firearms related systems at this time, and we'll visit him in some detail when we talk about the Nagant revolver of Russia, because that was really one of his designs. So this is a team effort that comes out, and the design and development's a little bit difficult to follow. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the final product of the design bureau, this particular rifle, the Mosin Negant M91 30 3-line rifle, and we'll talk about what all of that means as we cover that. Alright, before we talk about the design of this rifle, I want to talk to you guys about one thing. I know this is a very decisive rifle. I know if you're watching this video, you have an opinion. We'll talk a little bit at the end of this video about some of the myths, some of the things that people may believe about this rifle that's flat out untrue. What we're not going to talk about here today is our opinion of this rifle. We will save that for the video when we're shooting this up against its near peers, so we can compare it intelligently to other rifles of the time period. But I know you got a comment. I know you want to talk about how you feel about this rifle. So please, go ahead, drop down there to the comments. Tell us what you think about it. Because this is a rifle that most people either love or they hate. So with the design and the designers out of the way, we can finally talk about the rifle we came here to talk about today. The M91 30 Mosin Negant 3-line rifle. So let's start by taking a look at the name. So the Mosin Negant's pretty obvious. Those are the two designers that took over a chief role in the design. The 9130, this particular rifle was adopted in 1891. It went through some major revisions in 1930, giving us the M91 30 name. So that brings us to the question, what is 3-line? So a line is a unit of measure. It roughly equals 1/10 of an inch or 2.54 millimeters. So 3 lines gives us the bore diameter of this rifle, which is 7.62. So a 3-line is a 7.62 millimeter rifle. This rifle has a overall length of 48.5 inches, a barrel length of 29 inches. So that's pretty massive in comparison to its World War II counterparts. However, despite its size, it's only 8.8 pounds, which means it's not much heavier than a K98 or the 1903 Springfield. It fires a 7.62 by 54R cartridge. So 7.62 millimeters, 54 is the case length. The R is rimmed. So if we take a look at this cartridge itself, it actually has a rim built into the cartridge. If we look at that compared to an unrimmed cartridge, like the 30-06 for the 1903, we can kind of see where that rim would differentiate itself from most of the other rifles of the time period. 7.62 by 54R is a powerful cartridge. It moves at around 2,600 feet per second and delivers about 3,500 joules on target. So to put that in some degree of perspective, a 9mm will deliver about 400 joules on target. So significantly more. Now, when we're talking about it with its near peer adversaries in the 1903, the M1 Garand, the K98, those are all going to put about 4,000 joules on target. So it is not a powerhouse in comparison to its peers of the time period. However, compared to modern rifle cartridges, this is a very, very hard-hitting round. And don't forget, the Russians still use 7.62 by 54. So this is a cartridge that's still in use today. We do see these rifles pop up in some modern conflicts, but they are at this point in time obsolete. But these rifles have popped up in just about every conflict in human history. So, I mean, they have really been around, they pop up everywhere. And that's simply because the Soviets made a boatload of these. And they made them for a long period of time. And it was a rifle that the Soviets gave out cheaply as military aid. So let's take a look at this rifle overall, then we'll stop and take a look at two things in a little bit of detail. We'll take a look at the bolt and action and the magazine in a little bit of detail. So up here on the front, of course, no muzzle device. We do have a hooded front sight. It is a fixed sight. We also have this very long cleaning rod. So this rifle has a cleaning rod that is appropriate for its size. Unlike the K98, you have to have 3 cleaning rods from 3 different rifles in order to have a complete one for your gun. This one came with its own that is the full barrel length of 29 inches. We've got a fully enveloped handguard that covers the whole barrel to keep anybody from getting burned by this barrel as it gets hot. We've got these rifle bands to hold the two pieces together. As we get back here towards the back, we have these sights. Now, you've heard us say this before if you've watched any of our other World War II videos. These sights are, once again, set up for hopelessly optimistic ranges. They go up to 2,000 meters, which is, of course, well beyond the operational capabilities of a rifle like this. To be honest, they're well above the operational capabilities of your eyes. It is a very simple sight. There is no windage adjustment in it. There's only elevation adjustment. We've got a notch cut back here in the back of the sight. As we go back, we can see the magazine right here. We've got the trigger guard built into the magazine housing. This is something that kind of helps protect the trigger guard a little bit. Having an exposed magazine is one of the key design choices that everybody kind of looks at this time period headed into World War I, World War II. But we do have this exposed magazine that blends into the trigger housing. The trigger on the Mosins isn't particularly good, but it's also not terrible. This is one of those things we'll see a lot of guys complain about, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in kind of the miss of the Nagant at the end of the video here. We do have a very slender profile stock. We do have these sling cuts in the stock. Back here on the back, we've got a very, very simple metal butt plate. So let's take a look at the action. Alright, so as we're talking about World War II bolt actions, we usually are talking about Mauser-inspired designs or Mauser designs. This is most definitely not a Mauser. So let's take a little bit of a look at this action, talk about what makes it different from some of the Mauser style actions, and we'll start by pulling this bolt. We'll notice it is a 90-degree bolt handle off to the side. We will see some of these at a 45-degree on the PU Sniper variants, but the vast majority of them are these 90-degree bolt handles. One thing I do want to point out before we pull this out of the gun is that this bolt handle made into the side of the action here actually works as a giant third safety lug for this gun as well. So let's go ahead and pull this out. As we pull this out, we'll notice that unlike a Mauser where you've got a release on the side of the gun, this does not. You actually have to pull the trigger in order to pull the bolt group out. So with the bolt group out, let's take a look at a few features of this bolt. We'll notice a very small extractor on this. The rimmed cartridge means you don't need as big of an extractor as what you typically see on a Mauser designed for it to function reliably. The other thing we'll notice is two very large front locking lugs. One thing that we won't see on this bolt is any kind of provisions for gas or gas escape in the event of a ruptured cartridge. Back here on the back, we've got a very large cocking handle so you can cock the rifle like what we saw in the 1903, and this will function as a safety. So let's put this back in the rifle and take a look at the safety operation. So, with the bolt back in the rifle, this is something that a lot of people who even own these guns don't know is there is actually a safety on it. We can pull this cocking handle backwards, rotate it about 15 degrees, and the rifle is now unsafe. The one thing I will tell you, and one of the gripes that I do have with this gun, is this is very difficult to do. It's not very easy. It requires a good deal of effort to turn this rifle from safe to fire and fire to safe. So that is one of the strikes against the Mosin Negant. But overall, very good design on the bolt and action. We'll talk about some of the difficulties with it when we talk about some of the myths related to this gun. It isn't as fluid as some of the other guns at the time, and there's kind of an inherent sloppiness just due to the way that this track is made down here on the bottom and the way it fits into the gun. There is one reliability concern with these, and I'll decock it here so I can show you guys. The way that this track actually fits into the bolt handle is quite tight. If you do get any debris, anything in this right here, it will make the rifle not able to be not operable, and will require some work in order to clear this right here. And this was one of the few reliability problems with the Mosin Negant. So let's stick this back in the rifle. The Mosin's magazine is one of the beautifully simple components on the Mosin. It's also quite reliable. So if we look at this, we've got a release tab down here that will allow this magazine to open out. And then we've got a very simple, very reliable spring mechanism that allows quite a good deal of dust and dirt and debris to build up in it before it will begin to malfunction. It's also quite durable. One of the problems with the Lee Enfield is that their magazine stuck out from the bottom of the guns and got routinely banged up on stuff. And we look at this rifle as an individual, we'll look at some of the damage on this particular rifle, and this still functions quite well, and it works pretty much every time. So this internal magazine that's in this rifle is fed by stripper clips, so we can take 5 rounds of 7.62 by 54R, stick it right here in the action, take our thumb and push it down, and push all those rounds into the action. Now, unlike some of its peer adversaries, I can't just force this bolt forward and it automatically eject the stripper clip. I actually had to pull it out. However, I'll tell you that I don't think that's a big deal. I think when we compare this to other rifles of the time period, we'll find that that is very easy to overcome, and it's a little bit of a training thing, but as soon as you get the hang of it, not a problem at all. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this magazine, and then we'll take a look at this rifle as an individual. There is one other thing that I want to talk to you guys about on this rifle before we take a look at this rifle as an individual. So we've got around in the magazine, the chamber's clear. I'm going to take this, force the round into the chamber. Now, if I pull this backwards, I don't get extraction. In order to get extraction, I've got to go ahead and put this gun in battery and pull it backwards to get extraction. That is something that you do have to keep in mind with the Mosin. The other thing is, if you guys want to buy one of these, or if you have one of these, be sure that you check this weapon extremely well, because these rounds actually sit very far, and if we look at kind of where that sits, this round's going to sit almost all the way up there. So really do a good job checking to be sure that your chamber's clear when clearing these guns. It's a very important safety thing, and it is somewhat unique to the Mosin itself. Most other rifles we'll see are much easier to look in and actually see if the chamber's clear. This one requires a little bit more work, so be safe with that. So let's take a look at this rifle as an individual. This rifle's on loan to us, but it was purchased from Classic Firearms. So it was purchased from Classic in one of their recent runs. This rifle is an all numbers matching 1938, and you can always look at a Mosin and see if it's got this scallop cut on the side of the receiver to see if it is a pre-1940 or post-1940. But this is a 1938 example. It is all numbers matching. Everything appears to match all the way through. With that being said, this rifle's in pretty rough shape. We see pitting in almost every single metal component on this gun. There's clearly been some rust issues with it in the past. With that being said, the rifling is great. The action works as smoothly as a Mosin should work. So I think operationally it's fine. The other thing is this rifle has been refinished. And I use the word refinished loosely here. It looks like it was painted by a 3-year-old. Its bluing or lack thereof is very, very poor. The refinish on the stock is exceptionally questionable. This is the very worst example of a firearm that we will be shooting in this competition. With that being said, it functions perfectly. It is still just as accurate as it should be. The action works like it should. I don't think that this rifle's condition will affect how it performs as we're shooting these against the other rifles of the time period. But I would be very disappointed if I would have spent the kind of money that this rifle cost from Classic. I would have been very, very disappointed if I would have been the one that would have received this. Quality is really questionable. So, with that being said, let's talk about a few myths with the Mosin Negant. So, we already talked about it earlier. This is a rifle that either you love or you hate. So let's talk about some of the myths. So, if you spend any time around gun shows, you have heard these called moist nuggets, garbage rods. A lot of people have said these are cheap, they're unusable, unsafe, inaccurate, communist trash. So let's kind of break that down and talk about some of those items. Cheap. Yes, they were cheap for a while. There's actually a point not too long ago where you could buy an entire crate of Mosin Negants for about $75. Extremely cheap. But they weren't necessarily cheap to make. So I went and looked up figures, because some of these were actually made in the United States. So in 1917, Remington was making these for $22.50 a piece. $22.50 a piece in 1917 with inflation. That calculates to about $500, $510 today. So $510 bolt action is not particularly cheap. So yes, they were cheap in the US market. The reason they were cheap is after the wall fell, a bunch of these flooded into the country, and I mean in massive numbers. So the reason they were cheap in the U.S. market was simply because the numbers that were available to the U.S. shooters. Since about 2017, these things have really been going up in price. I think for a good example, one that's in better quality than this, you'd probably expect to pay about $400 a gun show today for them. Which, considering you could buy a crate for $75 not that long ago, they're certainly going up in price quickly. However, this is still probably the cheapest of any of these guns to buy and to shoot. And it is a good way for new shooters to get into the market of CNR firearms and to get their hands on their first World War II rifle, because they are relatively inexpensive. But I don't think they were cheap or cheaply made. The next thing that we need to talk about in this, unsafe. I actually think that the safety itself is questionable, but the actual way that the rifle is made is actually quite safe. Iraq veteran 8888 did a video where he tried to blow one of these up. I recommend going to go check that out. The way this third safety lug is made here, how big these locking lugs are, this rifle will really take some abuse before it fails. So I think unsafe is also wrong here. Communist trash. Well, they weren't designed by the communists. They're an Imperial Russian design with a lot of influence from around the world. I think that's just totally off base for these rifles. So, you know, the other one that you hear all the time is inaccurate. Is it as accurate as a K98 or a 1903? We'll put it to the test. But it's not too far off. You know, there's certainly not slinging lead everywhere. I mean, these are pretty decent in the accuracy. And like I said, we'll see some more of that when we put it up against its near peers. That's just some of those things that you hear out there, people say about these that just simply aren't true. The other one that you hear a lot on these is the action is terrible. It's not terrible. I will say this, it's a little bit clunky. It's not as smooth. Just the whole design in the many pieces that it's in isn't as smooth and doesn't feel quite as good as, say, a 1903 or a K98 or a Lee Enfield, but it's not horrible. So there is some truth to the action on these not feeling great, but they're not terrible. There's nothing wrong with them inherently by design. The other thing that you hear a lot about these guns is they're incredibly powerful. That's also not true. It is powerful in compared to a modern cartridge like 223 or even 7.62x39, but it's got a little bit less gusto than 30-06 or 8mm Mauser. With that being said, 3,500 joules on target is plenty of horsepower, but it's certainly not the most powerful rifle fielded by any of the combatants of the war. There's plenty of other things to talk about on the Mosin. I know you guys all have opinions, so don't forget, comment down there, tell us what you think about the rifle, and thanks for checking us out today on tacNtrack, and don't forget to subscribe. We got a lot more of these guns coming. Thanks, guys.
Ready when you are. Fire for effect. Sounds like you got it.
Yeah, I got it. Did you see the dartboard?
What's that?
All the dartboards came flying up.
Did they?
Yeah.
Wow, they did.
Yeah.
How's that possible?
The concussion from it hitting the water knocked all the boards up.
I wish we had that on camera.
Right?
I don't know if you can see it or not, but in fact, we'll walk out here. The bullet, the 7.62x54, passed through the can, the impenetrable Czech Cola can, into the water and knocked all of these boards out of place by the percussion, which is pretty impressive. They were in place before. It makes me wonder about standing on this dock. There's also some poop right there from, I assume, Brad or maybe another small animal. I don't know. Is that it? You know, if you swap shoulders, that's a lot easier to use your other hand.
Uh-huh.